the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight paths for him. And so John came baptizing in the desert region and preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. The whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem went out to him. Confessing their sins, they were baptized by him in the Jordan River. John wore clothing made of camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. And this was his message: after me will come one more powerful than I, the thongs of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Josephus was a Jewish historian who wrote extensively towards the end of the first century. And in his writing about the Jews, the Antiquities, as they are called, he mentions one called John the Baptist. He also mentions that John the Baptist was killed by Herod the Tetrarch, primarily because Herod was jealous, in Josephus' mind, of John's popularity. But there's an interesting note in Josephus' writing about John. He talked about his baptism, and he mentioned that how John baptized because people had become righteous because of their righteous acts practiced toward other people, and their acts of piety with respect to God. And then Josephus goes to great extent to say that John's baptism was not for the forgiveness of sin. It is because people had already become righteous. It was symbolic. As Amanda mentioned in the children's sermon, John dressed in a strange fashion, or at least from our vantage point, he did. And also, he was very tuned in to a certain region in the people's expectations. Now, with respect to his dress, animal skins, and his diet, if you read in the Old Testament, Elijah, the great prophet of Judaism, dressed in a similar fashion. So John was dressed in the manner a prophet was supposed to dress in. We might think it's strange, but in those days and times, if you were kind of a prophetic figure, it was not really out of place. And then with respect to the wilderness setting, well, go back to the Old Testament again. God spoke to Moses in a wilderness setting. It was in a wilderness setting that Moses led the people of Israel out of captivity. Elijah had God speak to him in a wilderness setting. David found refuge from King Saul in a wilderness setting. And by the time of Jesus, there was this popular belief that their deliverer, their Messiah, would come again from a wilderness setting. So in his day and time, though he was a bit unusual with the standard fare, John was not all that unusual with respect to the expectations of the people. And in the 11th chapter of Matthew, Jesus would say about John, truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist, yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Why those words? And why the compliment? There were a number of reasons, but one I want to focus on this second Sunday of Advent. For again, it's something I think in our society we see so little of in practice far too often. So, and that is simply this concept of humility. It really takes a great person who was willing to be second fiddle or let others receive the credit or the acclaim. In one of the interim pastorates that I've enjoyed since retirement, the piano player was a widow of a minister in his career, but who had spent a good number of years as an associate pastor at a fairly well-known church And the pastor of the church, and I mean nothing to take away from him, for he was accomplished in his own way. He was an individual who was invited around and received a lot of acclaim because of the success or the extent of the ministries of that congregation. But also, many people realized that it was not the minister so much who kept the church together in all those programs. It was that associate pastor, and I knew him through the years, who worked so hard behind the scenes that the ministry of that church might succeed and be effective, but also all the while knowing that he would not be the one, maybe outside the walls of the church, who would receive the acclaim or the attention. John the Baptist was that kind of an individual. And he was one who, as I read, said that there was one coming. And that was the one John announced. And the one who was coming, John said, I'm not even worthy to stoop down and untie his sandals. Normally that position was held by a servant or a slave in that day and time. And John was saying the distance between me and the individual who is to come is even greater than a master and a servant. John recognized his place and what he was all about. There's a message there I think we need in a society that sometimes is characterized by me first. And everything is about me is what is important. And it seems that outrageous behavior seems to what draw people attention these days. And any kind of humility or willingness to take a back seat is simply not appreciated, nor is it the way one gains fame in our culture, and far too often, my friends, even in our churches. Sometimes we give the most attention to the prima donnas or those who somehow, in outrageous behavior, even in the pulpits, gain the attention of others. But it's not what Jesus complimented. We read in John's Gospel about a Roman centurion who sent to Jesus because the centurion's servant was ill. And he wanted to know if Jesus might heal his servant. And he asked Jesus if he would to come. Now, a Roman centurion ran the show in that day and time, in that culture. He didn't have to ask. He could have commanded. He could have directed Jesus to come and pronounce a healing upon his servant. But his mannerism, as described in John, is virtually like a Marine drill sergeant saying to a new recruit, if you feel like it, would you please do some push-ups? It wasn't going to happen. But as Jesus traveled to visit the man, the guy says, or sends word, I'm not worthy to have you come even into my house. Send word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus was amazed at the depth of this man's faith and the expression he used. Humility. It is something we sadly lack, but we need in our society, in our homes, our culture, in our world. And how do you get it? Well, I can't offer an invitation this morning and say if you come down front, you're going to get humble all of a sudden. And I can't simply say that you can pick up a book and all of a sudden become humble because you read a book. It's a mindset. It's a mindset that others, created by God, are just as important and as valued as you. It is a mindset that God put us upon this face of the earth to serve. And we're not here to be served. It's a mindset that every life is of great importance to God. And God sent his Son into this world, which we are reminded of during this Advent season, because God saw dignity and worth in every human life. And when we see ourselves in that setting and what God did for us, even though we did not deserve God's gift, humility becomes a reality and begins to grow. But as long as it's, I'm the most important, it will not be there. I think it was my very first Sunday here with you a couple of months ago. I mentioned the fact that my mother's family was Church of the Brethren, and I made mention of a practice that they did, at least in the congregation I was familiar with. They had the Lord's Supper, or have the Lord's Supper, just once or twice a year, and it follows a full meal, as you did here on Thanksgiving Sunday. And as to the meal, before they have the passing of the bread and the cup, they pass a basin of water. And people get down on their knees and wash the feet of the person next to them. But if we read in John's Gospel, we will read that Jesus, when he did it to his astounded disciples at that Last Supper, he said to them, I've given you an example. And he wanted us to do the same. Now, we Baptists are fond of saying that we believe the Bible is literally true and every word in it. But we'll line up when it gets to that particular passage and say it's meant to be interpreted symbolically. Maybe the problem is we do not want to humble ourselves like that, even once or twice a year. But Jesus complimented John. And I think in large part is because of that humble spirit. Now, do not be mistaken. For those who are humble in the sense of John does not mean they have a weak-kneed, spineless backbone. Not saying about it. John was courageous and he was strong. But he was also an individual who recognized that there was one coming far greater than he. And he was willing to forego those who wanted to make him the Messiah or the deliverer. He was willing to forego that because of the importance of the one who was to come. He was the one who was worthy of worship and praise. And John always saw himself as servant of the Christ who was to come. John proclaimed his word because he knew a Christ was coming into this world. But John would not see the death of Jesus and the glorious resurrection. Herod would take his life a long time before that took place. And thus Jesus would say some words which we think are a bit curious about John. The least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. You see, John lived with just anticipation. The new era was yet to come. And it was the Christ who ushered it in with his death and the resurrection. And the new age began with that resurrection. And even the most immature and new Christian in the new era would experience something that John would not experience. A new era. We live in it. Though we probably need to be reminded time and time again about the example of one set by John in relationship to the Christ and the message of the Christ to humanity, which we do a marvelous job of not paying a lot of attention to in our world, in our own society as well. A new era. We're part of it. The Christ era. Yet at the same time, it also ought to be a very humbling experience. God came in a dramatic act of love. He died for us that we might be something better. That ought to humble us, folks. And it ought to radiate through our lives, our acts of service and charity. And all we are about during this Advent season and beyond.